I've been asked to talk about how mass incarceration can affect poverty. And I'm going to do so both from a conceptual and an empirical standpoint. But I just want to start out by re-emphasizing that mass incarceration in the United States constitutes one of the most profound social trends of the last number of decades. The incarceration rate in the United States has basically quadrupled since the early 1970s, from about 150 or so per 100,000 to 670 in 2017. And while it has declined a bit over the last couple of years, it still remains as the highest incarceration rate among advanced industrialized societies. Currently, we incarcerate over 2 million people, and there are over 7 million people who are under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system, if we include people who are under parole or probation as well. Now, the sheer scale of incarceration in the United States is usually the thing that gets most of the attention, but it is worth keeping in mind that incarceration is not spread evenly across the population, and importantly, it's both geographically and racially concentrated. In particular, it is disproportionately poor urban communities of color which have been hit hardest by incarceration. And that's important to keep in mind with regard to this topic, because that's one of the things that helps explain how badly mass incarceration can affect poverty in the United States. Indeed, some scholars, come back. There it is. Some scholars prefer to use the term hyper-incarceration rather than mass incarceration to emphasize that there are a number of communities that have extraordinarily high levels or rates of incarceration. That is, they are hyper-incarcerated rather than simply have a lot of incarceration everywhere. Now, mass incarceration can affect poverty for a number of reasons. I'm going to highlight 4 different perspectives on this. First, from an economic standpoint, mass incarceration or hyperincarceration means that a lot of income is taken out of communities. Most of the people who are incarcerated were working, at least to some extent, before they were sent to prison. And so that means not only that money was taken away from their families, but also with this idea of hyperincarceration, a lot was taken out of the community as a whole. Moreover, once these individuals come back into the community after they complete their sentences, they also suffer both a harder time getting a job, lower wages than otherwise would have been the case, and in the future, lower wage growth. And we've have very, very solid evidence from this on sociologists such as Diva Pager from Harvard and Bruce Western from Harvard. And this occurs for a number of reasons. One is that people who are incarcerated bear the so-called mark of a criminal record, the stigma of having been incarcerated, and therefore it's much less likely that employers want to hire these folks. Secondly, obviously, when you're in prison, you can't develop the kind of job-related skills that are necessary to earn a decent income, and you can't develop the kind of social networks that help you both get jobs and earn more money. In addition, once you get out, a lot of states make access to the social safety net a lot harder, if not impossible. And as a result, formerly incarcerated individuals do not have access to the kinds of programs that would help them earn a decent living and earn a higher wage, such as affordable housing, good nutrition, decent health care, access to child care, and so forth. In addition, the spouses or partners of those incarcerated also will have a harder time earning income once their partner or spouse is incarcerated, especially if they have kids. Obviously, they're going to have trouble balancing a job and child care, right? Dealing with unforeseen things like illness, transportation problems, and so forth. And in addition to that, kids who have an incarcerated parent disproportionately suffer barriers that make childcare an even greater challenge to the spouse or the partner who's left behind. For example, studies show that children of incarcerated parents can suffer greater incidences of fear, anger, anxiety, depression, behavioral problems than otherwise would be the case. Mass incarceration can also affect poverty from a sociological perspective. And here the idea is that an individual's social or economic position is not solely a function of their individual characteristics, the amount of education that they have, the amount of experience that they have. Instead, it also depends importantly on the community that they live in and how well important community level processes, social processes function, processes that everybody needs to thrive. One of these is social capital, that is to say the social networks that people have and the value that those provide. And these are very important in trying to earn a decent living. You know, they allow you to have information about jobs, someone to write job recommendations, information about childcare, about transportation, and so forth. A second one is what sociologists and criminologists refer to as collective efficacy. That is to say, the ability of a community to work on its own behalf to improve itself, the ability of the community to enforce its own social norms. And this is usually a function of the amount of trust in the community, the amount of familiarity among members of a community. And this can be very important because stronger collective efficacy means things like lesser crime in your neighborhood, a greater ability to get the vote out and vote on things that are important to the community, a greater ability to attract businesses and other economic resources to the community so they can all affect poverty. The idea here is that mass incarceration can interrupt these processes and as such leave people more vulnerable to being poor. One of the things that mass incarceration does is it creates what has been called a coercive mobility among the population. That is to say, the state's coercive power takes bunches of people out, again, especially if there's hyperincarceration, and then throws them back in at a later time. That is, it creates this kind of population churning, which both disrupts social networks and undermines the trust and familiarity that's needed for collective efficacy. And so both of those things can leave people more vulnerable to poverty. All right? The other thing that research shows is that whole communities can be stigmatized. Important work by Robert Sampson and Stephen Raudenbush shows this. And mass incarceration or hyperincarceration is one of the things that can do that. And simply because a community becomes incarcerated, what that means is that people are going to be less likely to get jobs, right? And businesses are less likely to move in. From a political perspective, mass incarceration can affect poverty as well. And Professor Remster is going to talk more about this, but I'll just mention in passing that it reduces the political power of communities because of felon disenfranchisement. Currently, all states except Maine and Vermont prohibit felons or people who are incarcerated from voting. In addition, there's a number of states which further prohibit people on probation and parole from voting. And further still, there are states that will permanently disenfranchise anyone with a criminal record for certain kinds of crimes. And obviously what this means is that the political power to express and support the economic and social needs of the community is going to be decreased. Once again, it's more likely people are going to fall into poverty or have a harder time getting out. Right? And lastly, it can also affect poverty from a public health perspective. For example, studies have shown that increases in incarceration in communities are followed at a short period in the future by increases in the incidence of AIDS and other sexually transmitted diseases, increases in teenage pregnancy and other public health concerns. And what that means is people in the community are going to be less able to work, and if they work, they're going to be able to work fewer hours. Also, all of these things taken together imply that it's going to be much harder for people in these incarcerated communities, especially when they're hyper-incarcerated, to earn the kind of income that is necessary to support their family and get themselves out of poverty. Given all of this, Professor Hannon and I undertook a pair of empirical studies which sought to see if, in fact, the mass incarceration we've seen over the past number of decades has actually affected poverty, and if so, how much. Both of these studies have been published, and what we effectively did was we estimated statistical models using available data that tried to establish or see if there was a link between incarceration rates in various areas and associated poverty, holding other things constant. That is, we did that to try and better isolate the particular effect of incarceration on poverty. And we looked at both overall poverty and child poverty in these two studies. And so we used state data over time for the study of overall poverty, and we used county data from North Carolina over time to study child poverty. And our two studies produced several significant findings that are relevant for this issue. One is that we found in both cases a statistically significant link between incarceration in these areas and poverty, whether it was overall or child poverty. And what that means is that as we found a link, and it was not simply due just to random chance. But secondly, it was not only statistically significant, but it was substantively important. In fact, what we found was that the mass incarceration that we've seen has left several million more people in poverty than otherwise would have been the case. And based on our estimates, about 5 million additional people would be a reasonable estimate. And if you consider that currently there's about 40 million people who are officially poor, an addition of 5 million people is a fairly substantial increase. And then finally, we found that not only it affected poverty, but there was a disproportionate effect on poverty in areas where there was a higher fraction or a higher share of minority residents. That is to say, a given increase in poverty would have a much more adverse effect if there was 40% minority share of the population in an area than 10%. And this makes sense. It's unfortunate, but it makes sense because those communities tend to be more vulnerable in any case on a variety of dimensions, and therefore less able to withstand a large external shock like hyperincarceration. So just let me quickly conclude here. And I'm happy to expand on any of this, and I'm sure Professor Hannon as well during the question and answer. But we have a situation where the United States is a clear outlier in the world in incarceration. And that record-setting incarceration has come with several big costs, both the direct cost of keeping all of these people in prison, but also, and that could be up to $180 billion a year, according to Brian Stevenson's organization. But it also comes with even greater social costs in terms of what it's done to communities that are hyper-incarcerated, poverty, among other things. And given that most careful studies find that the mass incarceration we've seen has had very small impacts on crime reduction or increases in public safety, it's highly unlikely that this policy would pass a basic benefit cost test. So even by that narrow criteria, this policy is completely misguided and should be reversed, and hopefully the declines in the incarceration rate we've seen in the US over the past couple of years represent the start of a longer downward trend rather than a temporary blip. So thank you.
So I actually just realized, since this is a session that is organized in honor of Brian Stevenson and his brilliant social justice memoir, I just realized that he was before the Supreme Court this week on Tuesday, and he was arguing an Eighth Amendment case on Tuesday. Eighth Amendment, where are you? What is it? Oh, dude, you're sitting right in the front row. It's the prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, and he is challenging the execution of a man by the name of Vernon Madison, who is 68 years old and has spent the last 33 years in solitary confinement. Vernon Madison suffers from vascular dementia, which has rendered him absolutely incapable of understanding the fact that he is about to be executed, as well as what he is being executed for. So I was going to give a very different talk today because I'm doing research on child visitation in prison, but in light of the fact that Stevenson is before the Supreme Court and the death penalty is on the docket, I want to sort of just pose this conversation around the impact of mass incarceration on children and families through the frame of the death penalty, and in particular a case that I was very closely involved with. In Stevenson's words, I became proximate to. And I want to argue that mass incarceration, the death penalty in particular, give rise to something called familial death. Sociologists, economists, political scientists have talked about economic death associated with mass incarceration, that people are prohibited and find themselves prohibited, obviously, while they're incarcerated, and then find all kinds of barriers to economic participation, labor market participation, this form of economic death. Prisoners also undergo civic death, both inside and on the outside, that prevent them from participating in American governance, particularly voting. But prisoners and their family also encounter something called familial death. And my colleague at NYU, Lynn Haney, is using the term to refer to different kinds of policies, particularly policies in carceral settings, that disable and distort and ultimately destroy family relationships. And some of those policies include things like sending people very long to serve time in prisons that are very, very far away from their families, that make it all but impossible for children and other family members to visit. Telephone policies that charge outrageous rates for prisoners to call home. Visitation policies that restrict visitation or restrict visitation to behind glass and make the experience for children and families almost unbearable with respect to the kind of searches that they have to undergo just to see their parents. So one thing that is unique, and I'm thinking about with respect to familial death, is that it radiates out of the prison. That is, that it impacts simultaneously both the prisoner and their family members. And in fact, it's multi-pronged, so that children and other people who've committed no criminal offense experience it in its most intense and most brutal forms. So I want to talk today and think about that concept today around this execution, and I'm going to take you back to 1997. Obviously, I was approximately 4 years old. And in 1997, when I was approximately 4 years old, was everyone born? Oh, God. Some of you were not born? Okay. Well, whatever. It was the 90s. And I met a family. I was in graduate school as a bright young 4-year-old. And in graduate school, I was working as a prison ethnographer for a very well-known criminologist by the name of Jim Inciardi. And Jim had me collecting a lot of data in state prisons throughout the state of Delaware and some work in Pennsylvania. And at the same time, I was also an activist in the anti-death penalty movement, both in Pennsylvania and in Delaware. And in that year, in 1997, researchers hadn't started using the phrase mass incarceration, but mass incarceration was well underway. So I meet Shakira first, and I meet her through my work in the anti-death penalty movement. Her husband was on death row in Delaware, and at that point, he had just lost an appeal in the federal district court. She wanted help on legal research. She wanted help on a commutation petition. She also wanted help on persuading a lawyer to take up his last round of appeals. Her husband, Haneen, was guilty of murder, and he didn't deny that. Shakira offered to me a very detailed account of that murder and of his case, and argued, like Brian Stevenson has often argued, that the injustice of capital punishment extends well beyond wrongful convictions. And if you were at my talk at the law school a few weeks ago, I promise I'm giving a different talk. So I'm not going to talk about the ins and outs of his case. I want to talk about how his case, how his incarceration, and how his execution is experienced by his family. But just an overview of the case very quickly. Ameen shot a young man by the name of Hodges, a man he had never previously met in person, during a drug transaction at the Tri-State Mall in 1991. Mr. Hodges died as a result of a single gunshot wound to his abdomen. Up until that point, Hameen's life had been characterized by violence, abuse, and poverty. And as with so many perpetrators of violence, Haneen was himself a victim of violence, his earliest encounter at the age of 5 years old. Prosecutors in the case were unsure if the shooting occurred during the course of a robbery or it was a dispute that arose during a drug deal that had gone south. And although there was absolutely no evidence that Haneen went there that day with the intention to shoot Mr. Hodges or that the shooting was in any way premeditated, Haneen was charged and convicted of felony murder, which is a capital offense at the time in Delaware. During the penalty phase of his trial, Haneen maintained that the shooting was both accidental and in self-defense. Both the judge and the jury found his explanation to be contradictory and nonsensical, and the jury voted unanimously in favor of execution. The judge affirmed that decision and set the initial execution date of December 7th, 1992. In 1997 is when I meet them, and I meet Haneen's only son, Ameen Carroll, who the family referred to as Little Haneen, and he was 15 years old at the time I met him. From the age of 10 or so, he'd go through phases where he would visit his father intermittently in the prison. Sometimes he visited several times a month, other times it might be every other month, depending on the availability of transportation and the work schedules of his caregivers. I want to emphasize, though, that for Little Haneen, the institution of the prison was formative in his life. It was as formative or more formative than the school, than the family, and in the mosque. In the prison, and in the crucible of the carceral state, he learns about the world at large, and he learns about the government, and he learns about the family, and he learns about the law, and he learns where he fits or doesn't within all of that. When Haneen is initially sentenced to die, Little Haneen's behavior changes drastically. He starts getting into fights, he spends time in a juvenile detention facility. By the time he's 16 and Haneen's appellate options are winding down, he begins to regularly ask Shakira if his father is really going to be executed. When Haneen loses that appeal in federal district court, Little Haneen again gets into trouble, this time aggravated assault. He's sentenced in 1998 to a correctional facility. He used that time in the facility productively, in that he became active in the Islamic community, he attended school, and he sought treatment for his quote-unquote anger issues. After he's released, he remains active in Islam, plays on several athletic teams, earning praise from his coaches. I was able to find a sports article from 1998 that covered Ridley High School's basketball game against Pencrest, and it noted Ridley's Ameen Carroll took over in the third period, scoring 10 of his team-high 23 points to give the team a lead into the final quarter. By 2000, Haneen lost an appeal before the Third Circuit that I helped draft. The only other stop was the U.S. Supreme Court, and that was an extreme long shot in that they only take a few death penalty cases out of the hundreds that are filed with them every year. And the impact on his son was obvious. He dropped out of sports and began spending more time in the streets. That same year, Haneen, as a death row inmate, moved to the new Supermax facility that the state had just built. There, death row inmates were kept in isolation, allowed out of their cells 2 to 3 times a week for recreation and showers. Contact visits are prohibited. All visits occur behind glass. And whenever he saw his family, Haneen was forced to appear with his hands and ankles bound. In 2001, the U.S. Supreme Court denied Haneen's petition, and he, along with Shakira and Little Haneen, attend a hearing in which the judge sets his execution date for May the 25th, 2001. Little Haneen looked at Shakira and said, "Are they really going to kill him?" And she couldn't answer him. A few weeks later, his son attempts suicide. His mother found him unconscious on the bedroom floor. He was taken to a hospital where his stomach was pumped. He had overdosed on drugs. And Shakira recalled to me, he went to counseling, but he didn't talk. He didn't say much. He didn't want to talk to anyone, although he would talk to me. I think he expected me to fix the situation. He couldn't understand why no one was doing anything to stop his father's execution. He asked me details about how his father would be killed, and I tried to answer him. On May 18th, Little Haneen insisted on speaking at a hearing of the Delaware Board of Pardons, who had been convened to consider the possibility of commuting the sentence to life in prison. Now 20 years old, he goes before that board and cries as he begs them to spare his father's life. He told them that he couldn't live without his dad, and that he relied on his dad for advice and support. Ultimately, those pleas fell on deaf ears. After listening to 4 hours of testimony from Haneen's family, his friends, and even from prison officers and staff, all in favor of commuting the sentence, the board denied the petition. A few days later, the family goes back to the prison to say their goodbyes. His wife, his son, his stepchildren, and his grandchildren, his brothers and his sisters, his mother and her friends, and his friends. He had been transferred to the death house where contact visits were forbidden. They were forced to say their final goodbyes behind glass. Shakira and Haneen's mother elected to witness that execution. The rest of the family did not. Shakir describes having to go through an extensive and humiliating search of her clothing, including her undergarments, her body, and her hair. She describes what happens next. At 11:59, they let us into the room first. We were surrounded by guards. Behind the glass, Haneen was lying on a stretcher spread out like a crucifix. He was lying there, and I'm on the other side of the window and watching him die, and knowing there's nothing I can do to prevent it. It was horrible. I felt stupid that I was standing there letting them kill my husband. It was unreal. And then they brought in the victim's family, and I'm thinking, this is the most bizarre thing I have ever experienced. Haneen looked at us, and we locked eyes, and he smiled. I started praying. The warden asked if he had anything to say. He spoke to the victim's family first. I'll leave that aside. Then he said, he just wishes them well. Then he says, Mom and Shakir, I love you, and I'll see you on the other side. That's all. The warden put his hand up, and they did whatever they do. I just kept looking at him. His body lifted up off the table, and he gasped. The warden shut the curtain and pronounced him dead at 12:07. We walked over to the car, and they gave me some of his things and told me that I had to go to another building to get the rest of them. At a press conference the next morning, then Governor of Delaware, Ruth Ann Minner, issued the following statement, quote, "The state of Delaware this morning carried out Abdul Hameen's penalty for the murder of Troy Hodges. I pray the completion of this sentence, recommended by a jury and imposed by a judge, will bring some amount of closure to Mr. Hodges' family." But what of Hameen's family? Abdullah Hameen's penalty was also his son's penalty, his mother's penalty, his siblings' penalty, his wife's penalty. It was a punishment that impacted his entire family, a family that was wholly innocent of crime, with equivalent levels of brutality, mercilessness, and violence. I lost contact with them by 2003. At that point, little Haneen had 4 kids of his own, was not working or was working intermittently, spending most of his time on the streets. Damn it. She just gave me the 3-minute sign. I'm not saying damn it to you. Let me just fast forward. I did some investigating when I was doing an article based on this talk. And so today, Ameen Carroll is 36 years old. He's incarcerated in Pennsylvania. He's had an escalating series of crimes, including aggravated assault, car theft, weapons charges, and finally murder. So how do we make sense of this? A tragedy that begets another tragedy, each radiating out to impact a broader network of people, families, and communities. Let me just read a quick quote from Shakir in 1997 when she described what it was like to be a person who was not convicted of a criminal offense, yet living in the shadow of criminal penalty. She says, "My husband is on death row, and every day, every minute, I live the sentence with him. I'm the victim society would like to forget about because I have no rights. I don't have the right to hurt because, after all, my husband committed the crime." Of course, executions represent the extreme end of the continuum that is mass incarceration. And although very few people, comparatively speaking, are executed in this country, mass incarceration, even in its mundane guises, destroys human lives. And further, the lives that it destroys are not only those of persons who are charged with and convicted of crimes, it destroys the lives of legally innocent people, particularly children. And since Dr. DeFina mentioned the impact on children, I won't go through a lot of that, but there's an underestimate out right now that at least 2.7 million children have a parent who is serving time in a jail or state or federal prison. Most of those children are under the age of 15. Most of those children are African American and Latino. The kind of trauma that little Haneen encounters and the manifestations of that trauma in his life, dropping in and out of school, assaultive behavior, being involved in detention facilities, drug abuse, depression, suicidal attempts, those are common across children who experience parental incarceration. In fact, the research demonstrates that parental incarceration puts kids at risk across every conceivable domain: academic, economic, behavioral, legal, and medical. What's driving it? Some of it has to do with material deprivation, social poverty, social isolation, family instability. But I'd also argue that some of what we see with kids is linked to the violence of the system itself. Mass incarceration is premised on the systemic denial of humanity, of not only the people who are suspected of and convicted of crimes, but also of their children and loved ones, and of their friends and neighbors. Mass incarceration replicates the most tragic elements of crime, specifically the transformation of a victim from a subject to object, and extends this from the incarcerated person to members of his or her social network, even though they've done nothing wrong. In this instance, as in the case of migrant children being moved under cover of night to tent cities in Texas, the state not only fails to protect children and families, it intentionally and deliberately engages in practices designed to bring about their destruction and death.
Okay, so I'm here today to talk a little bit about a project that I've been working on for the last couple of years with Dr. Rory Kramer, who's also in the Sociology and Criminology Department. Specifically, the title of our paper is Shifting Power, the Impact of Incarceration on Political Representation. And it's actually finally coming out in the next few weeks in Du Bois' Review. So I can skip this slide since we all know how much incarceration dramatically expanded in the last couple of decades, how it was not always this way, and focus in specifically on political representation. So in order to understand why incarceration might be distorting representation, it's important to know a little bit of background. Robert Dahl described the idea of political representation as a critical concept for democracy, right? Because political representation allows democracies to be possible in large nation states, which without it, we literally would not have a democratic society. But the notion of representation creates its own problems. How do we define it? Right? As you may recall from grade school, political representation has been very controversial since the founding of the United States. When writing the Constitution, the forefathers argued heatedly over how to count slaves, which was known as the Three-Fifths Compromise, and largely is often addressed as one of a defining race issue in the United States. Right? The 14th Amendment later abolished that 100 years later, but even after the 14th Amendment was passed, states continued to apportion political districts unequally, with population sizes varying dramatically across districts. It wasn't until 1962 in Baker v. Carr that the Supreme Court specified that each person represents one vote, and that each person has the right to have their vote heard equally. Right? As a result, equal representation today is based on population counts. Right? So that's an important concept. While we've been legally debating that for many years, our current definition of representation is based on how many people live in a district, not whether they can vote, how old they are, whether they're a citizen, whether they are mentally sane, or whether they are incarcerated. So all we need to ensure equal representation in the United States then is population counts, right? So where do we get these? From the census. In fact, that was the sole original reason why the census began, was in order to divide up our districts so that we could elect representative officials. So in order to count mobile populations, the census established what they called a usual residence rule, which requires people to be counted at the place where they live and sleep most of the time, right? So under this rule, prisoners are counted in the correctional facilities where they're incarcerated, right? And as a side note, incarcerated people cannot vote, as Dr. DeFina mentioned, in 48 states. But that actually doesn't matter that much for our purposes because representation is based on total population, right? There's been a lot of, as a side note, attention to the issue of felon disenfranchisement and how, because in most states, incarcerated folks cannot vote, which, by the way, is that we are the only Western democracy in the entire world to have such a policy, how that has shifted election results. Right? But today, Dr. Kramer and I thinking about political representation is something that happens long before people ever get to the actual voting booth. Right? So, if prisoners were randomly distributed across space and drawn randomly from racial groups, it wouldn't matter how the census counts them. Right? But you all know better, you're here, you've been thinking about this and listening and knowing that there's a good chance because of how concentrated incarceration is both spatially and among racial groups that it might indeed affect it, right? So because prisons are mostly located in rural, which happen to be predominantly white areas, is one major reason why counting prisoners as residents of correctional facilities might distort representation. And the other issue that's an important angle that has gotten a little bit less attention in the research that Dr. Kramer and I argue is equally important is that the communities that lose these prisoners, lose their family members to be incarcerated in a correctional facility in a rural area very far away from their home, is those folks live in urban areas and are in primarily communities of color, right? So you might be wondering, why am I standing up here in 2018 talking about this issue when the usual residence rule has literally been, was enacted in 1850 and perhaps earlier. The reason why it didn't matter how prisoners were counted was because we had so few people incarcerated for most of America's history that it didn't matter, right? No one was concerned about it because our incarceration rate was so low. But due to the rapid expansion, all of a sudden it became an issue, and the policies of using the usual residence rule has remained the exact same, right? So, in noting this issue of counting mobile populations, I'd also like to highlight and compare incarcerated persons to the military, right? Because the military is another, although different population, is also highly mobile. And importantly, the Supreme Court has ruled that military personnel can be counted in their home community while they're serving overseas, right? Arguing essentially that what they call an enduring tie exists, that even though those folks are probably living abroad for a few years on a military base somewhere in the Middle East, that they are still heavily invested and a substantial community member back home, and that they should be included for political representation, right, purposes. So military and incarcerated populations actually have a lot more in common than what you might think, because the military and prisons are both total institutions, meaning that their interactions are heavily restricted from their physical surroundings as well as their social interactions, right? So like service members abroad, incarcerated persons have little to no contact with the community where they are incarcerated. Instead, both groups retain their social ties heavily to their home communities. There are also physical barriers like tall walls, fencing, series of locks, these kinds of things that separate service members and incarcerated persons from the surrounding area, right? In fact, because of the sequestering nature of total institutions, when polled, legislators do not view incarcerated persons in their districts as constituents. Instead, they actually report that they view prisoners that would normally be living in their district but incarcerated elsewhere as more of their constituents than people who are physically incarcerated in their own districts. So given what we know, there's, taking these factors together, a lot of rationale to think that, like military personnel, incarcerated persons have an enduring tie to their home communities. Right? So our big research question that Dr. Kramer and I have been thinking a lot about is what would happen to political representation if incarcerated persons were counted in their home communities. Right? So we use what's called a counterfactual approach. We want to know what representation would look like if people were counted back home. Right? How would that shift what political representation looks like specifically in Pennsylvania? Right? So we do this in a couple of ways. First, we look to see when prisoners are counted in their home districts, whether any districts are in violation of the Supreme Court's one person equals one vote rule. We also look at the extent to which incarceration shifts political power geographically, whether, as hypothesized, it's really shifting political power away from urban districts to non-urban districts. And finally, we also look at how racial representation in districts in Pennsylvania is affected. So I'm happy to talk more about the data and methods, how we did all this in the Q&A afterward, but for now I'm just going to highlight a couple of our key findings. So there are 203 House districts in the state of Pennsylvania. The average district, so once the first step was taking all the people out of correctional facilities across Pennsylvania, right? And then we didn't just remove them, we put them back in their home communities, right? So once we do that, once it's essentially kind of a deprisonized Pennsylvania, we find that the average district across all 203 districts doesn't change that much. right? But there's an incredible amount of variation across the change, right? In fact, 34 districts gain or lose more than 837 residents, right? And that's one standard deviation's worth. So when we remove people and count them where they actually live, where they have an enduring tie, 34 districts gain or lose more than 800 people in their district, right? So first we took a look at the geographic differences, and here is a map of Pennsylvania districts, denoting in gray are the ones that lost more than one standard deviation, more than 837 residents, and the black is what is districts that gained more than 837 residents. And the first thing that I want to note is that the districts that lose the most residents are concentrated in sort of our central and western Pennsylvania. These are the most rural portions of our state. In contrast, the districts shaded in black are, those are the ones that gain the most, and these districts are concentrated in southwestern Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh area, and eastern, former industrial cities such as Allentown and Reading, and of course southeastern Pennsylvania. So you can't really see what's going on in the southeast. We're going to take a closer look at it because over 1/3 of Pennsylvania's population lives in southeast Pennsylvania, and on this slide you can see that the districts which gain more than one standard deviation, more than 837 residents, 2 of them are contiguous. That's why you can't, there's not 3 that jump out at you, but they're located in the heart of Philadelphia's African American neighborhoods, right? So 3 of those 4 districts. And then District 70, which is northwest Philadelphia, also gains more than 837 residents. That district contains Norristown, a predominantly Black and Latino municipality. Turning to our districts that lose more than 837 residents, 2 of the 3 are located outside of Philadelphia's urban core, right? Whereas District 173 is located in northeast Philly up there, and that contains Philadelphia's main jail facilities. So, importantly, once we count people where they actually in their home communities, 4 of these districts would legally be too small using the Supreme Court's 1 person equals 1 vote rule, right? And how do we calculate that in Pennsylvania? They take the census, total population of Pennsylvania divided by 203, and then each district has to be within a 5% margin, plus or minus. So this is 2010 data. It was 59,455 people was the lower bound, and 65,702 for the upper bound. So importantly, those 4 districts that are legally too small, the most of them are all outside of urban areas, right? So in other words, representational equality, which contemporary democracy hinges on, is not achieved in 4 districts if we count prisoners in their home communities, right? So District 150, which is located in Montgomery County, lost the most residents in all of our analyses. They lost 5,000 residents because it includes Graterford, which many of you know well as Montgomery's county jail facilities. And so that district would legally not stand. It's constitutionally in violation if we were to count prisoners where they actually live, right? So we call them phantom constituents, right? They're only meeting the legal constitutional requirement by stacking the deck with people who are not meaningful members of their community, right? At the same time, we've also got, at other end of the spectrum, 4 districts are too large, right? And that tallies up to approximately 263,000 Pennsylvania residents are constitutionally underrepresented. Regarding our geography, all 4 of those districts are either urban or in a central city. And so what we really see overall is that rural suburban districts benefit at the expense of urban districts. When we take a look at our last set of findings is our looking at what this does for racial representation. shows that prison location benefits the typical white voter, and it weakens the average Black or Latino voter's representation in Pennsylvania, right? So our calculations show that the average white person's district would lose roughly 59 residents, right, in our counterfactual situation with prisoners counted in their pre-prison districts. So in other words, prisoners are artificially inflating the average white person's voting power and representation in their district because prisoners make white districts' total populations grow, but they don't add a single actual voter to the district, right? Implicit in that calculation is that Black and Latino voters live in districts where that have lost more to incarceration than they gain, right? So when we return people to their pre-prison residences, the average Black and Latinos voter districts gain 353 residents for Blacks, right? And there would be a massive influx of residents into their districts, and 313 new residents for Latinx residents of Pennsylvania, right? So in short, we've got Black and Latino voters being diluted in comparison to white voters because Black and Latinos are less likely to live in districts where prisons are located, right? Which inflate the number of non-voting residents compared to whites. So in all, were incarcerated persons counted in their communities, over 100,000 Black residents of Philadelphia would live in a district that's deemed too large for Pennsylvania's districting requirements, right? And 3 of the 4 districts that grow too large are majority minority districts. So if prisoners were counted as living in the residence, in their residence of origin, there is a substantial likelihood that we would have an additional majority minority district in Philadelphia, and that would be enough to satisfy the Voting Rights Act requirements. So we're talking about a substantial racial impact is where we really see the biggest effect. So summing up, our results show that hyperincarceration affects political representation in several ways. First, we've got the 4 districts that are violating the equal representation premise via district size, most of which are rural or suburban districts. These results also indicate that non-white political representation is diluted considerably because Black and Latino residents are disproportionately spread across geographic regions because of incarceration, right? Finally, urban and political voices are substantially underrepresented because of incarceration. 3 of our 4 districts that are too large according to district size requirements are urban. Right? So this is perhaps a less obvious way that mass incarceration affects all of us. It's fundamentally reshaped our democracy. There's been a lot of attention to racial gerrymandering recently, and for good reason. But we find that an additional form of racial gerrymandering is actually occurring before political boundaries are ever drawn by the impact of where prisons are located, right? Which then geographically spread out racial minorities from their home districts. So as a result, the average white voter's voice is artificially inflated, while the average Black and Latino voter's voice in Pennsylvania is shrunk or silenced. Right? The same is true about suburban and urban versus rural districts. So by and large, hyperincarceration not only drains voters out of urban Black and Latino districts, which some have focused on, but it also at the same time is artificially inflating the population of white, suburban, and rural districts without adding a single voter to those districts. Right? While racial representation was supposedly resolved in many ways in the 1960s via the Voters' Rights Act, can't say that today, and a series of Supreme Court cases, today racial representation has reemerged, we argue, as a racialized system of punishment. And so mass incarceration is reproducing racial inequality, and one way is through political representation. Fortunately, I will leave you with some good news, because perhaps unlike many of the other drivers of racial inequality in the United States, like incarceration or health, political representation is a form of racial inequality that can actually be pretty easily remedied. Our findings suggest, obviously, that states should consider how to count prisoners in their future redistricting efforts, which, by the way, happens every 10 years, which is why we collect the census every 10 years, right? Otherwise, hyperincarceration is going to continue to produce unequal representation. But a handful of states have already formally done this. Maryland and New York did it before the 2010, no, Maryland and California? Oh, I'm having brain freeze. Well, regardless of the exact timing, Maryland, New York, California, and Delaware have all successfully, with multi-agency collaboration and adequate resources and planning, counted their prisoners in their pre-prison addresses and redistricted accordingly, as well as many local municipalities across the United States have changed how they count for political apportionment. Importantly, as of 2010, the census actually changed how they release the information, making it much more easy for states, local, even county, whoever wants to change their political apportionment, just has to literally separate out. They have to subtract the group quarters information, which they have a separate category for prisons and jails, from their district populations, right? And then they have the pre-prison, all their correctional systems contain the pre-prison addresses to put them back. It's a little bit easier said than done, but, and we struggled ourselves when going through this data, but it is certainly doable, and 4 states have already been doing this in the process, and many states are in the process of considering, as well as a number of jurisdictions around the United States. As our results suggest, such an endeavor is critical to having a representative democracy. Thanks very much.